Welcome to the Greater Culture Podcast, where we have conversations about how to elevate the quality of life through movement, nutrition, recovery, and mindset practices. And welcome to another episode of the Greater Culture Podcast with your host, Brad Marshall. And today, really excited to be joined by Kyle Ruth, someone I've gotten to know over the last couple of years, being affiliated with Training Think Tank, and excited to sit down and learn from him as an athlete, as a coach, as someone who's been in the space for a while. So Kyle, thanks so much for spending some time with me on the podcast today.
Yeah, Brad, thanks for having me on. I'm glad that when you were at the last Training Think Tank camp, you were like, "Hey, you want to be on the podcast?" I'm really glad that that whole interaction took place, and now we're here getting a chance to have a chat. I think it's cool.
I've been fortunate that I've gotten to have a few of your colleagues on here too who've vetted the process and have made it a little easier for other folks to jump on here. So excited to learn a little bit about your history and hear a little bit more about your story. Because like I said, as someone who competes at the highest level of the sport within their age group, someone who's coaching athletes of all different levels, got a lot of perspectives. So I'd love to hear what your sort of origin story is like, and how did you find your way into fitness?
That's a great question. And I wish that I wish there was like a linear answer that I could give you, right? That led me here. I remember being a kid, I'm about to turn 40 this year. I turned 40. So I grew up in that generation where we played literally every single sport imaginable growing up. Our school we had access to soccer, flag football, basketball, etc. But I also was in taekwondo and judo and swimming and track club, and like I literally did all. I remember there was a time, I think around 5th grade, where after school I went directly to basketball practice, and then my parents picked me up from basketball practice, drove me downtown for my taekwondo and judo practice, and then after that I ate in the car and went back for swim practice. Now that only lasted for like a month before my mom was like, "I'm not driving you around to all this anymore. You got to pick two." And so at that point, I was much better at taekwondo and swimming than I was basketball. So basketball had to disappear. But I kind of just did that, as a kid. I was like, oh, bounce between all my sports. Even when I was like, as a freshman in high school, running cross country, running track, I still did swim practice on top of those things. And so it was just a very natural thing for me. I'd come in the morning, swim in the afternoon, go out for cross country practice, and didn't even think twice about how that is actually kind of insane. You know what I mean? Like if you look at that from the perspective, from an athlete perspective, you're like, you're doing 2 tough cardio sessions every day. Yeah, no big deal. And I was barely fueling myself. I have like maybe my Carnation instant breakfast and a cinnamon roll, and like eat half my school lunch and yeah. So that was like, I just was, as a kid, I loved being active. And I think for me, I definitely have some ADHD tendencies where you'll see me on this podcast. Like I'm constantly in motion. Even when I'm working, I'm like constantly moving. And the reason I found and fell in love with swimming. So I was a swimmer. I swam collegiately, swam post grad. The reason I fell in love with it is because it made me so tired that I could finally sleep and it would shut my brain up. And that, I think, is one of the main reasons that I fell in love with fitness, and specifically like a harder aerobic or anaerobic style exercise, because that was what was required to just get all the stuff in between my ears to finally shut up so that I could, sit still for a little bit. And I remember being a kid, probably in middle school, like if I didn't go to swim practice, I remember being like all fidgety and anxious throughout the day, like, oh man, I need to go do something. And then I'd just be like sprinting around on my bike. But I found that having a structured practice or a structured training session throughout the day just made me feel like a calmer person. And I liked the way that I felt a lot more after that. And as I got into, high school and teenage and post grad, every once in a while we'd have time off. And during that time off, I just found myself doing crazy, stupid stuff. Like, okay, there's a bunch of rocks, big boulders in our backyard, and I'm just going to like pick them up and throw them over my shoulder. Like I'd watch, World's Strongest Man, and I was like, I'm going to be world's strongest. Here I was at, 160 pounds. Like I'm going to be world's strongest man. With all that to say, like I knew I knew probably by the time I was 15, one, that I wanted to coach, two, that I was going to be a lifelong athlete in something, that I was just going to continue to be athletically and competitive in something. It didn't matter to me what I was doing, just that I was doing something that, pushed me to challenge myself. And so I have just kind of had that as a journey always. Even when I was swimming, collegiate swimming, we would do, our dry land strength and conditioning stuff. And I rode my bike everywhere. Like I couldn't stop myself from moving constantly. And then in college, I had a really good strength and conditioning coach my freshman year. And man, I got into strength and conditioning. Like I realized then that I think I loved the weight room and loved that style of training, plyometrics, and learning the Olympic lifts and things like that. That I love that maybe as much, if not more, than swimming. And what I realized is that I like the training in the gym more, but I loved racing. Like it took me a long time to realize that. And I didn't love swim training. I loved swim racing. And it turns out that when I found CrossFit, which was just exercise racing, I loved it way more than swimming, because you're like, all right, I love racing, I love training in the gym, and now you're going to take these two things and make them one? Like, please give me more of this. So it was almost an instantaneous for me. I think I was 26 when I swam my last meet, and I had decided that, and it was actually a great meet. Like I had broken my own state record at the state meet and qualified for nationals in 100 breaststroke for the first time. Like I typically just swam 50 freestyle, 100 butterfly, and 100 freestyle, but I had just started working on developing breaststroke and I'd finally like kind of had it all click and qualified for nationals in all four. And then I was like, I'm done. I decided I was going to run a 50-mile race that lasted 2 weeks. And at that point I was like, I have to have something else. So I found CrossFit. And as soon as I realized that I could compete in the gym, racing, fitness, I was like, this is for me. And I've been doing that now for almost 15 years. So
one of the things I love about that journey is so much of it, you highlighted that you enjoyed moving just to move, and the feeling you experienced and being able to shut your brain off and sleep better at night and made you a better person. Most of what I was hearing there was this whole intrinsic driven nature to it of like, I just like to move and I like to swim. And then you highlighted later on sort of the performance aspect came along with sort of the competitive side. Where would you say was that shift for you of, hey, I just love to move, I love to train, I just love the sheer act of doing it? And then you realize like, okay, I actually like competing too, because now you've been a competitive athlete for a long time.
That's a really good question. I think it's probably twofold, and they happened almost at the same time. The first is, I hit puberty, and at 15, like there was just I don't know if it's testosterone, I don't know if it's the brain changes, I don't know what it was, but I went from like, I just need to do this because it makes me feel good, to like, I want to beat everybody in everything. Right. And I think that that's kind of just like a classic teenage, a teenager type thing. But I think that was like, there was a fire already, and all that all the teenage hormones did was just pour fuel on that fire for me. But the other thing is I had trained long enough. So like I started swimming around 9, which is late for swimmer, which is insane to think about. Right. I've got a 12-year-old and a 7-year-old daughter. And to think that my 12-year-old couldn't go into a sport, and being 12 and like, hey, you're a late starter is kind of weird, but it's late for swimming. But I've been doing it long enough at that point. I was 6 years into kind of year-round swimming, that I was good enough that I had started to see some success. And I got my first sectional time trial cut, and like, oh, I'm pretty good at this. And so it was like a snowball effect, right? I was like, I'm pretty good at this, and I want to beat everybody and everything I possibly can. And the two came together. And at the same time, I don't know how I connected the dots, or how I hadn't connected the dots prior to this, but the same time I connected the dot that if I like worked hard in training, not just like move to move, but if I went in and I like pushed myself, that I actually got better faster. And maybe I'm a little dense, you know what I mean? Like maybe I would still say I'm maybe a little thick or a little dense in that regard. But all of those three things happened right around 15, and it was just like rocket fuel for me. And yeah, I consumed at that point too. Like I wasn't the kind of person who read books. I would read like a Lord of the Rings or something like that, but I didn't read. And man, I consumed. First thing I did is I read an entire book on nutrition. Then I read like this book, Swimming Fastest, which is like 1,200 pages of training physiology and program design and template design and swim technique. Then I started having my dad was a professor at Ball State, and he started pulling books for me they have a great exercise physiology program from the library on like plyometric training. And by my senior year, I'd created my own dryland training program. We had conditioning class in high school where you could, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I had access to the gym, and I convinced the conditioning coach. I laid out my program, which was all built to help improve swimming. And he looked at it and he was like, well, yeah, you can do this. This is fantastic. And so there I was off doing my own thing. But like, I'm telling you, it was that combination of factors was like rocket fuel for me as a competitor, where before, prior to that, I just kind of enjoyed, the social aspect of being with, training with friends. And that's why I ran cross country. I wasn't particularly good. I was a sprinter. CrossFit has built my endurance, but I liked doing cross country because my friends were running cross country. My older brother was running cross country and his friends. So it was just fun to go do. And it was another opportunity for me to get really tired doing something. I just wasn't particularly good at it.
Yeah. One of the things I'm hearing here that I love is I'm starting to get a picture of this environment, noticing that your dad's a professor, so academics and studying is probably built into the place you grew up. But when some folks get really invested in something they love, they seek out mentorship or coaching or whatnot. And you went the route of, let me go learn this almost for myself, of reading books, reading magazine articles, creating your own program, which I feel like at that age, you don't see or hear a lot of that. Was there somebody that you either learned from, or was this more of a self-guided journey of like, I don't know who to ask, so I'm just going to go find the answers myself and create this program that's going to help me?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So where I grew up in a really small town, Yorktown, Indiana. Like my graduating class, I think was 106 or 116. I can't, that was obviously a really long time ago. It was really small, super small school. And we got lucky in that we had this coach, Jay Agnew, who moved in when I was also at 15. Like I'm telling you, it was like the perfect. But he came and took over the high school program and the club swim program at the same time. And he was really knowledgeable. But there were definitely some deficits. He'd never coached, like a high level performance swimmer. He'd coached people that were good at like the state level, but never had anyone qualify for nationals, never had anyone qualify for junior nationals before he showed up. So I was really the first. I was the oldest person on the team, fully bought in. I was really the first person that he'd coached through that. So while he was a good coach, one of the things I realized, like he had no knowledge on dryland training or strength training. So our dryland was like, I think he had us do like 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups before we got in the pool every day. And I was like, there can be a lot more to this. So I knew that there could be more, but the problem is growing up where I did in such a small town, there just weren't resources around. Like we were, an hour away from Indianapolis, which is where we would have probably had the easiest access to mentors and things like that. Maybe at Ball State University, but the Ball State University, they defunded their swim team before I was a freshman in high school. So it was a volunteer swim team. So like by my junior year, I was faster than everybody that was on the Ball State swim team. So like the resources didn't exist. And so for me to be able to get better, and I was hungry and driven to get better, I had to go out and consume information from wherever I could get it. It was also, I don't want to call it the early days of the internet, but it kind of was the early days of the internet. So there wasn't a ton of information available online. Like bodybuilding.com had something from Jason Lezak, who was an Olympic gold medalist 50 freestyler, and it had a program that he followed. And like I used that as a template. I used the stuff from Swimming Fastest and just kind of constructed my own thing. The one thing I did do that I think was awesome is there was this elite sprint camp that I went to before my senior year. And there finally I had access to like an elite swim coach. The guy's name was Mike Bottom, and he coached the Olympic gold medalist in the 50 freestyle in like 2000 Olympics, 2004 multiple Olympiads. He knew what he was doing. And so I had access to that for the camp. And that was another thing that was almost like it was less like the physical side. Like, it wasn't that we did crazy training while we were there. It's the way he talked about intention in training. And that's two things I learned there that I carry through now as a coach to everything that I do. And the first is, you need to be able to justify every single thing that you put into an athlete's training program. If you don't have a reason for it being in there, it gets cut out. The second one is just to think outside the box, right? So he told this story. So we're going to go way back. People, younger listeners will have no idea who I'm talking about, but he coached Gary Hall Jr., who was the Olympic gold medalist in 50 freestyle, maybe in 96 and definitely in 2000, and ended up qualifying again in 2004 when he was starting to kind of age out of the sport. But Gary was like really hard-headed, and, he was like the coach's nightmare athlete, like super talented, but wouldn't do any of the things that they wanted. And people had tried, the carrot and the stick to motivate him. And he just like wasn't particularly interested. Mike Bottom, the coach, had this opportunity to go work with Gary just for a short period of time as like this little trial, like 2-day thing where he was meeting Gary. And the first thing that he did, Gary was swimming, and Gary was doing open turns. And if you know anything about swimming, when you're swimming freestyle, you do flip turns because they're faster. But Gary was doing open turns where he'd come into the wall and do this lazy, super slow, super lazy turn. And Mike Bottom, the coach, when he got done with the set, was like, "Man, Gary, that's genius." And Gary's like, what are you talking about? Like, all the attitude. And he's like, "You're doing open turns so that you're never practicing a crappy flip turn." And Gary's like lit up and was like, "Yeah, that's totally why I'm doing it." But Mike's point was, the coach's point was, that to motivate certain athletes, people that are already intrinsically motivated, to keep them motivated, sometimes you have to let them come up with their own ideas, to think that they have arrived at the solution. And I have carried that forward as a coach, and an athlete as well. Like, one of the things that my coach in high school, and even when I worked with Max as a coach and now with Adam, when I have ideas, man, they're like, "Yeah, let's run with it. Let's run with it." Now, I think I've at this point earned the right to be able to be like, "Hey, I have an idea. It's probably pretty good." Now, when I was a high school athlete, I think my coach had some foresight to think like, "Hey, if I let him do this, he's going to buy in more." But those are two like super important lessons that I learned just from that camp. But that was more rocket fuel for the way I thought about training versus the actual like performance side of it.
Yeah, I think being able to make that connection of the training and all those things you do when, folks aren't watching or you're with your team, and how that impacts what you show up with on game day. It does take some people more time than others to make that connection, because some people are like, "Oh, we're just going through the motions, just another weight session, just another training session." And it's like, they just want to play the game. They're like, "I hate all this in between time. Just get me on the floor in the pool." And that is tough.
I just wanted to race. But at some point, like I said, probably around 15, I connected the dots that if I trained hard with good intention, that I would race better. And so it was like, oh, I have to do all this stuff to make myself race better. So then it was even more buy-in.
Was there a point in time where you felt like you fell in love with the process and the journey and the training, or is that still just something that's like, I know I have to do it, I don't necessarily love it, but I love the way it's going to help me perform on game day?
It's a really good question. I think I've gone in cycles, right? Like I said, I wish there was a linear story here, but it's definitely not. I think my senior year, I was so driven that the process was, I knew that the process, the training was what I had to do right in order to get the outcome that I wanted. But even when I was in college, the training just felt so disconnected from the goal, right? We were doing so much volume, and I was swimming a 19-second race, and we would do 50 100s and stuff like this. It just felt, the training itself felt so disconnected from the outcome that it was hard for me to buy into the process. And I think that's a big one, is I'll probably touch back on buy-in a couple more times, but so during that phase I felt a little disconnected. But in CrossFit, you have to feel connected to the training process to be successful. Like in swimming, you can be talented. You know, you can have long arms and short legs and a long torso and big hands and big feet and good ankle dorsiflexion, and you can be fast, right? But in CrossFit, there is no like you're just born with all the stuff that's necessary to be successful. Like you have to embrace technique training for handstand walking and handstand push-ups and ring muscle ups and rope climbing, all the stuff that we did at the camp that you were at. You got to embrace the technique side, but you also have to embrace the training side too. And you've got to build, short, fast, high power output into the spectrum. And you got to build the long, slow endurance into the spectrum. You got to build all of it. And if you aren't in love with that process, you are not going to be successful. And you won't be doing it for very long, because at some point you're either going to get hurt because you don't have the training foundation that's necessary to support you going out and trying to race every day, or you're just not going to be very good. And so you're going to be like, well, this isn't that much fun. I'm not very good at it. So I think at some point, obviously, I connected the dots and was like, the training process is the whole thing, but it also helps that I have more input now, like versus when I was, an undergrad swimming. Like I had no input in what the training program looked like. So, and because I didn't have any of that autonomy, it was hard for me to buy into what I was doing. But now I can say, hey, Adam, I think we need to do X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z are going to show up in my program. So I have a little bit of autonomy too, which helps create some buy-in to that training process.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to this idea of motivation. And a lot of people like to look to this idea of self-determination theory of how do we help motivate people, keep them invested in the long haul. One of the main pieces is this idea of autonomy, of like, do they have some say and some buy-in in the direction that they're going and how they're going to get there? Then there's this idea of competence, of you're experiencing that. Hey, I'm getting better. I'm noticing changes and improvements. And then the last one is relatedness, of just like, am I in a community or a shared group that helps me stay the course? So I think that highlights a lot of this idea of the process isn't always the most exciting piece, but there's ways we can continue to get people to be bought in and connected to help them stay the course to get to the destination that they're striving to. And one of the things I'm curious of then is, as you made that transition to CrossFit when you found it, the few folks I know who are swimmers, they typically don't have great shoulders and hips because of the just overload and the same motor pattern over and over again. What was that process like for you making that transition? Were you somebody who, as you walked into CrossFit and fitness and with all the different demands that the body's asked you, that you felt pretty comfortable in those different positions and movements? Or was that something you're like, wow, swimming certainly gave me this aerobic base that was incredible, but now I am far behind when it comes to mobility and certain movements and things like that?
I was a unique swimmer. I was a sprinter. And so I didn't have as much wear and tear on the joints as I think a lot of other, other swimmers, people who specialize in like 200s, 400s, the milers. My younger brother was a 400 IM and miler, and his body was pretty broken when he finished college swimming. I was on the opposite end. I was really healthy, but I also had invested a lot in the weight room the whole time. Like, so, starting from 15 on, I took the weight room just as seriously as I did the pool. And I think that paid off for me. I was really strong for a swimmer in college. So it was a very easy transition. I mean, I think I started CrossFit with like a back squat was probably 425. My deadlift was a little light. It's probably like I found this the other day. My PRs from like the season before I started CrossFit. I think my back squat was 425. Deadlift was like 375. Bench press was probably 335. And I could do a weighted pull up with 200 pounds, and I weighed 185. So it was a 385 pound weighted pull up. So like I was pretty strong coming into the sport. The one plane of motion that I was not strong in was overhead pressing, because as a swimmer, like you just generally avoid overhead pressing because you don't want to get shoulder impingement, and it's not really beneficial, right? Pulling is the sport, not pressing load overhead. I mean, you're bringing your own arm up, but my arm doesn't weigh 200 pounds. So there's no reason to bring, to train that. So like I couldn't do a strict handstand push-up at all, but I could, rip off push-ups, and my shoulder press max was probably like 145, and I was benching 335 or 355. So that took a bit, but I'd already had a well-developed squat pattern, and I had great shoulder mobility from holding streamlines and things like that. And I didn't have all the pattern overload that a lot of swimmers have from just swimming laps. Usain Bolt talked about how he never ran laps, right? Once I finished undergrad and was swimming postgrad, I never swam laps. It was all sprint stuff, like, band resisted stuff. We had pulleys that were basically like pulley systems. So the transition into CrossFit for me was relatively straightforward and pretty easy, from a movement and mobility perspective. I definitely wasn't I've never been the most flexible person. I'm definitely wired pretty tight, but I'd already trained heavy squats and gotten into good deep squat positions and things like that. So it wasn't that challenging for me to learn those things. There were definitely some compensation patterns. Like my pistols were terrible. It took me a long time to build good pistols. But I trained so many plyometrics that like rebounding box jumps I was like, oh, I do these on a 40-inch box. Like some of the things were supernatural. Like we did rope climbs. We did touch and go legless rope climbs in college, as part of our swim training. We had a day, it was always Wednesday, where we did touch and go legless rope climbs, saw who could get the most. I think I was the first person. We didn't have any team records or anything, but I was the first person to do 3 up and down. And you go down to seated and go back up. I'm not even sure I could do that now. And then we had plyos mixed with that day. And it was just like lateral box jump overs, forward box jump overs, stride jumps and stuff like that. So like, it was just a box jump rope climb day. So, some of the stuff that we did there carried over really well. And like having a 380-pound weighted pull up made learning ring muscle ups really easy, and learning butterfly chest. Like I didn't have to build the shoulder stability, because I already could do, I think at some point around that time, I could do like 30 unbroken strict pull-ups. Again, can't do that now, but that transition was relatively easy for me. What I didn't have as a swimmer, having been a sprinter who didn't swim laps, I didn't have an aerobic base at all. Like long, easy stuff, threshold stuff, all that was absolutely awful. And that is what I have spent the last 15 years trying to build. So it'd be very interesting to compete now against my 26-year-old self when I first started CrossFit, and see how much I've actually changed in that span of time. Like my 500-meter row at that time was like 117, and I don't think I could touch that with a 10-foot pole right now.
It's fascinating when you look at the sport of fitness and the width and breadth of it, of what's being asked of you. And I think it's always fascinating too when you look at people's backgrounds who didn't start in CrossFit at a very young age and work through it. It's like, what was their base? Like, were they like football, baseball? Were they like basketball? Were they a swimmer, weightlifter, whatever it is, gymnastics, and where they're at when they start, and then how they get better over time. And that would be a really interesting comparison to see power output from mid-20s raw versus now maybe a little more seasoned, a little bit more efficient with certain movement patterns, and over the long haul, who could take the other one down. That would actually be a very fun simulation to run.
It's crazy to think. I think my back squat is probably about the same as around the time I started. So, probably let's say I hit 470 this past season, which was a lifetime PR, but I would bet right now I'm probably closer to like 440 or 45, which is pretty close to where I started. And my mile time when I started was 540. And I know that my mile time right now is about 540. So those two metrics haven't changed, but I was way faster then, and I'm way more enduring now. So if we like compared across like a 5K, a mile, 400 meter, I was faster in the 400 meter then, but faster in the 5K now. But the mile, like that middle point hasn't changed at all.
It is fascinating how there's certainly ebbs and flows, I think, to fitness as well. As soon as you realize there's either a hole or an area you want to shore up, you spend a lot of focus on it. And, just because of time constraints, sometimes other things fall a little bit. So you're trying to find that balance. And when you found CrossFit, you mentioned that the idea of fitness racing, people come to CrossFit for a lot of reasons. Some are just trying to get healthy. Some find it and it feels like a sport or a competitive environment they were in previously. When you found CrossFit, was that the primary focus for you? Was I really want to be competitive and use it as my outlet for racing? Or did you also see it as hey, I'm in my mid-20s, I want to stay healthy? What was your sort of perspective and viewpoint when you found CrossFit and got into it?
Yeah, I think on one hand, that's not why I walked through the door. My wife and I had just moved to Charlotte, and we wanted to continue training. We had a garage gym, before we had moved, and we wanted to continue training, but I wanted a place where I could do Olympic lifting and a place that I could train with her, where we could just go and do the same workout. I was going to get what I needed, and she was going to get what she needed. And CrossFit seemed like the place. But the moment I walked through the door, we did their intro, which their intro workout was way too hard. It was like 400-meter run, 21 pull-ups, 400-meter run, 15 push-ups, 400. I don't remember exactly, but I did it. And as soon as I got done, the guy that was running my intro, Preston Austin, he was like, "Hey, you want to compete in this?" And I was like, "You can compete in this?" Like, that's a thing. And he's like, "Yeah, so he won sectionals that year. And he's like, "Yeah, just come train with me." So within, a few weeks, I'd already lost the original intention, which was for me to go in and just have a place to do my Olympic lifts. And for my wife and I, now granted, my wife Haley and I, we trained together there a lot. And we ended up taking over that gym eventually. But very quickly, I was already trying to train with Preston and learning the ropes from someone who was really, really good when I got in. So it was not my intention when I found the gym, and when I walked through the door. I actually didn't even know that you could compete in CrossFit at that time, but it quickly became the intention as soon as I knew that it was a thing and had a good like doorway to get into competitive CrossFit.
And then it sounds like at some point in time, there was the element of coaching and saying, okay, I like this thing for my own health and wellness and for something to do with my wife. And I like coaching or being able to take over gym. So at what point in time did you start to notice that aspect of it as well of, oh, let me see if I can help other people with this too?
Well, yeah, at the time I was a swim coach. So I coached at a place called Swim at Carolina, where I worked with some of the senior athletes, and then I had an opportunity to work with their team elite there, and was running dry land training for team elite, which were basically just Olympians. It's either Olympic hopefuls or Olympians, and that's what I was doing. But also, it was 2012, so it was going to be the end of the Olympic year, and I was looking for something to do afterward. Because one of the things I'd realized is, like, with coaching swimming, you're gone every weekend or every other weekend. And, my wife and I were thinking about having kids at the time. And I was like, man, I just don't know if I want to be gone, every other weekend or every weekend with when I got a baby. Like, that doesn't seem like what I want to be doing for the rest of my life. So I just kind of shifted gears. As soon as I got into CrossFit, I realized that I wanted to coach CrossFit too. Like, I liked that as much because it was the strength and conditioning coach aspect that I enjoyed, but it was a competitive strength and conditioning coach aspect. And that's really something that I resonated with. So that kind of is what transitioned me from swim coaching into CrossFit coaching. And I think the other thing that I liked about it is that one of the things I've always tried to do is inspire people to get into fitness. Fitness just in general has done so much for me since a young age. And even when I was a high school swim coach, when I was in graduate school and I was coaching just high school swimming, I always just tried to get people to fall in love with the weight room too, and to fall in love with fitness. And it's been really cool to see that a lot of those same people have gone on to be, one of them's a professional triathlete. Two of them are super heavily invested in mountain biking and like a part of the actual competitive mountain biking community. Like, a lot of the athletes that I coached went into some form of fitness is in some way, shape, or form a big part of their life still. And I realized that through CrossFit coaching that I could get adults to create a lifelong fitness habit as well. And I thought that was, to me, that's, I think, as important as any of the other things, as the competitive side and things like that. Competitive side provides me with a lot of motivation because I like it and it resonates with me. But in the end, I think what I've always been trying to do is to get people to train well, train smart, and develop these kind of habits that become part of their life. And I realized very quickly that was one of those opportunities.
Yeah. And I think when you look at CrossFit as methodology trying to help people live happier, healthier lives for the long haul, have that sort of enduring health. And then the competitive aspect is in there as well. How do you, or how have you teased out sort of those two different approaches, if you will? I know there's moments where it feels like they're in alignment, where I can focus on my health and fitness and I can compete and enjoy that. There's moments where maybe it goes too far in one direction. And I think when you're looking at sort of the general population, mentioning running a gym, most of the folks coming in there are focused on just general health and wellness. You do have some folks who like competing, but how do you tease out those, even maybe in your own experiences over the years of, is there a place for both of them to coexist, or is it kind of like you got to focus on one or the other, or what does that look like in your mind?
I think for me, at least the way I've approached it personally has always been in cycles, right? So I think about it like training blocks. So if I'm preparing for the CrossFit Games, I recognize that I'm going to sacrifice some of my health to some degree, dealing with more joint discomfort than I normally do, over consuming carbohydrate relative to what I probably should be consuming, um, you know, training, honestly, overtraining, or at least overreaching pretty significantly for periods of time. Your sleep quality starts to degrade. Like there's definitely hits to your health that are occurring. There's sacrifices that occur, but I also know that there's an end point. And I think that's one of the nice things about using competitions as these sort of like short-term motivational tools where, all right, so for me, you just qualified for Fittest of the Coast. I just qualified for Fittest of the Coast. So now I know that I'm going to push myself pretty hard to February. But after February, I'm going to be able to take the foot off the gas a little bit. Open is not something I'm concerned about, moving on through for the rest of the season. So I can take my foot off the gas a little bit and focus in on health a little bit more. And that's really how I've always tried to approach it. Maybe not always. It's how I've tried to approach it more as a master's athlete. As I've gotten a little more wizened in my old age, I've tried to to think about it like, hey, like just like everything, just like the earth we have our cycles, we have summer and fall and winter and spring. That I need to have seasons to my competition. That I need to have some seasons where I'm pushing myself and really trying to expand my boundaries and take myself outside of my comfort zones. Maybe I'll sacrifice a little bit during that period of time, but also swing back the other direction and take things easy and not push my joints and push my body. And like right now is one of those times. My body feels fantastic, right? But when I was prepping for the games, I had to have a cortisone shot in my shoulder because at some point I had some terrible bursitis. The left side of my neck was killing me on a daily basis. I think I just needed a new pillow, but I'm not. Maybe it was too many handstand push-ups or both combined. I had this thing in my left side of my back that had been going on basically since like March. It was never like bad enough to stop me, but it was there all the time. And I was eating 550 to 600 grams of carbohydrate per day. And I mean, I'm a 200-pound guy, but at the same time, like that's a lot of carbohydrate. Like you're definitely taking a hit on your insulin sensitivity. And I was just running myself hard, but I've gone, come back full circle to the other side of it. My joints feel great. I'm eating a much more balanced diet, not over consuming carbohydrate, and my food quality is better. So like, it's important to go back and forth. And I think there's definitely people, even masters athletes, who just, they fly too close to the sun, so to speak, the Icarus problem, and they push themselves too far, too long. And the older we get, the less resilient we are to that kind of overreaching. We just got done filming that section in the coaching conditioning course where we did a whole section on aging and what happens to your endocrine system, what happens to muscle tissue and connective tissue and stiffness and things like that. And, we actually looked at data on resilience and training tolerance and training volumes and things like that. And the reality is there's no escaping the fact that your ability to recover from volume load, from intensity times volume, decreases as you age. And I think that one of the best ways to combat that is to have periods of time where you're going high and periods of time where you're going low, so that you can just create balance from the long term rather than trying to force balance every day and hope that you're going to get the best of both worlds.
I love that approach of thinking about it in terms of cycles and seasons of like, it's really cool to have a goal. And for a lot of folks, maybe it's you want to run a 5K, 10K, half marathon. Maybe you want to sign up for the local competition or give a go at the open, and understanding that there's probably going to be some of those trade-offs to accomplish that goal and try and work towards your potential in terms of performance, but then also knowing there's moments to back down. And so I'd love to get your perspective if there are insights you've learned, because now, having been a competitive athlete for 13 years, some would say that's a long time to compete in this sport. You start to look at folks at the top, that like some of them burn out after a couple of years, some of them have made it to 10 years. And you look at some of their transitions out of the sport and what does movement and health and fitness look like for them after. You're someone who's continued to do both. So what have you learned over those years that has helped you to stay in it and keep wanting to compete and keep feeling like the juice is worth the squeeze?
I think the first is, at least for me, integrating fitness in some way with my family. It's always been important to me to spend time and train with my wife. My wife and I currently what that currently looks like is we do a Sunday long run together. She's training for high rocks. I'm obviously not training for high rocks because that's a really long distance. And we already talked about how long distance is not my jam. But yeah, we do our long run on Sundays right now. And like, it's just part of what I'm doing. So I've integrated fitness in that way. And it used to be that my wife and I on Saturdays, we would do a chipper together, a hundreds chipper. And we would always just do this partner hundreds chipper on Saturday, regardless of what our goals were. We always were going to connect and do it on Saturday. And, when my kids were younger, we put them in the bike buggy and, I'd have one in the bike buggy and the other one would be riding their bike, or when we go on long runs, they'll hop on the bikes and go with us. So we've just made sure that in some way, shape or form, our fitness is always integrated with the entire family. Whether that's hiking or, getting the kids to do a workout after we do a workout, or doing partner workouts with them, even if it feels super remedial for us. And now they're starting to get older. And so it's, they have their sports and stuff and they're still integrated and, still doing that and a little bit less integrated to what we're doing. But it's, my wife and I are still, training together as much as we possibly can. So I think that's one thing that's been important. It's always been a priority. In fact, when I first started working with Adam as a coach and pursuing, a master's goal, he was like, what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you not willing to sacrifice? And that was very much on my not willing to sacrifice list, was just, having this be integrated. So I think because it's part of just what we do as a family, I have that support. So I think that's a big part of it, is that it never, my training and my fitness has never felt like it's a chore for other people. I never feel like I'm sacrificing time with them to go do something for myself. It's always been something that like we're all involved in as a family. My kids love to watch me compete just as much as I love to watch them compete. So I think that is an important thing. It's also like it's a full social support network. I think having seasons, I think recognizing there's going to be periods of time where you are going to be putting more time and effort into training, and periods of time where you can kind of step back a little bit and, focus more on taking care of yourself or focus more on others. My wife's about to do this high rock, so I'm, very invested in helping her prepare for the high rocks versus, when I was getting ready for the games, we were all very invested in my preparation for the games. And so just making sure that, there's time where everybody gets some focus and I think that's also really important. Then I think at the foundation is good nutrition and good just habits in general, just recovery habits. Even though I may not be the best sleeper in the world, I'm in bed for 8 to 8.5 hours every single night. And I prioritize sleep above everything. Like there's no thing that could be on TV for this one time that's going to make it so I'm going to stay up late to watch it. On the weekends, my kids still go to sleep at their regular bedtime. My wife and I go to sleep at our regular time every single night, and we do not deviate from that ever. Like I am ruthless about maintaining sleep and sleep quality. Luckily, my wife feels the same way. We both love our sleep. So I think taking care of that, taking care of nutrition, I when I'm in these cycles where I'm not as focused on fitness, I'm still, 80-20 clean, 80% of the time, 20%, give myself some leeway, but I still feel, I track my macros every single day and just have been very, diligent about doing that. I think by staying committed to that for a long period of time and staying consistent with that, it's just made it so that it's easier for me to come back, right? So I don't have to, when it's time for me to get in shape, I don't have to lose 5 or 10 pounds of fluff because I didn't put 5 or 10 pounds of fluff on during my time off. Really, I just have to rebuild my damn engine every time, which is a challenge in itself. And it would be way harder if I had to lose 5 pounds on top of building that engine back. So I think just staying consistent with that stuff and I have a daily stretching routine that I do on a regular basis. So just consistent, good habits, even when you're in your down cycles, and just not letting go of that stuff. There definitely were some times where when I would cycle away from hard training that I would also lose touch with some of those habits. But you were asking what I've learned. Stay in touch with the little things that you do outside of training, the stuff that's not in the 2 hours in the gym. That makes as much of a difference when you're trying to cycle back into your higher training periods of time than anything else you could do.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great lesson, because when folks build in a movement habit, whether it's going to their CrossFit class or whatever that looks like for you, there almost comes a point in time where that's the easy part of the day. It's like, I just show up, I do my hour, and I leave. It's the other 23 hours that are the harder part of what are my habits around sleep and family and nutrition and recovery. And those are the things that we miss out on. And then we can sometimes either blame or be like, oh, the gym's not working, when we start looking at, well, what are all the other factors that are helping to support that? And so this idea of just having good, healthy habits for your general overall lifestyle will help you regardless of the season you're in, of, hey, I'm training more, training less, whatever that looks like. So focusing on those can be a really powerful tool. Along with that, one of the things I'm curious to get your perspective on, because you've been in it for a while, and you mentioned that even training up for the games, physically ailments pop up, aches, pains, cortisone shots, etc. Is there a way that you've come to think about when you're experiencing discomfort or pain or something's kind of achy? Because at least from my perspective, when I think about working with clients, that's one of the top things that'll pop up of just like, oh, CrossFit's like really hard on my body, or like makes me really sore or really achy, or like, oh, it just gives me a bad shoulder. And I feel like it's one of those things that there's a certain perception around it, but it also causes people to say, hey, I'm going to find something else that maybe isn't as intense or doesn't load the joints as much. How have you thought about that, or maybe interacted with some of your clients over the years to help them as they think about like, oh, I've got this really sore shoulder, or like, oh, my legs are so sore today, and continue to encourage them that it's okay to keep moving or work through that, even when you're experiencing some of that?
I think the most important thing, and this just takes time and experience, but that's learning the different types of pain that you might experience from training. Like a great example, like you sprint on an assault bike, and you're going to experience a lot of pain, but that's not the kind of pain that you need to avoid. That's actually a type of pain that you probably need to go into. I mean, just from a health, we were just talking about health, even from a health perspective, building up high levels of lactate and acidity is a positive thing. It's a signaling molecule for the body that tells it to like clear out dead and unhealthy cells. And potentially there's some solid research, it's like anti-cancer. So like you need to feel that kind of pain, and you probably need to feel it on a regular basis in order to stay healthy. Like humans were kind of wired to do that. And then there's like muscle soreness and stuff like that. Again, not a type of pain that should be avoided. You probably shouldn't train through serious muscle soreness. That's a recipe for disaster, but getting sore is a good thing, right? It's like telling you that you're giving your body a stimulus that it hasn't really experienced in a while. But as a coach, your aim should not be to make people as sore as possible. Like any idiot can write training to make people sore. It takes a good coach to create a balanced program that creates, soreness in the right places at the right times. But then there's the joint capsule pain, and that's the stuff that I worry about more. When my shoulder, when I was having issues with my shoulder, we pulled back. I wasn't doing anything with the upper body for a solid week around that, and it just didn't. when you've done this long enough, you can tell the difference between something that you need to pay real close attention to and something that you can say, all right, it's just an ache. It's just an ache, and it'll fade. The other one is the kind of chronic stuff. Like I had some stuff going on with my elbow that it hurt for weeks and weeks and weeks, but it was never bad enough to stop me, but it was always kind of present. And it was that's one of those things that when I'm in a training cycle for a competitive event, I'll just accept that I have to train through that. But I also have to make note of that when I'm done with a competitive event, that rest, rehab, prehab, all that stuff is going to have to happen afterward. So I think on the one sense, CrossFit does beat up your body, but what competitive sport, what competitive sport that's similar, in a similar domain does not? The competitive swimming, which is as low impact as it gets. I've seen just as many people out with, shoulder and hip injuries or ankle injuries from, too much plantar flexion. I've seen that happen just as much. So anytime you take anything to the max, like there's the risk for injury goes up, both acute and chronic. The risk that you drop a barbell on, missing a snatch and drop a barbell or hyperextend your elbow or something like that. That risk is there, especially when you're pushing loads to the limit. And then there's the chronic risk from doing too many kipping pull-ups and doing, too many lunges and doing too many squats. Like those are the realities of taking anything and saying, I want to push this to be the best that I possibly can at it. You just inevitably are going to have to ride the line of too much to too little and try. Of course, we always try and stay right in the middle of that, like perfect bell curve. But the reality is you're going to have to tip over sometimes, and sometimes you're going to have to pull back. And it's a game of inches with that. But, I think for most people who are just going to a CrossFit gym, the big thing to learn is to learn the different types of pain. The ones that you should listen to, where it's like that patellar tendonitis, hey, we need to back off knee flexion for a while, versus my quads are sore. That's probably okay. It's you can probably keep going. Now, again, don't take it to an extreme or anything like that, but learning the different types of pain, I think, is probably the best thing that someone could do there.
Yeah, and I think having coaches and people that you trust who've got some experience can certainly help guide you through that as well and walk you through the steps of, okay, what are we dealing with here? What does this look like? Chronic, acute? How long has it been present? Are we able to do certain movements? What's our pain threshold looking like? Is it a 3 or less or a 4 or less? Is it more than that? So those are all important factors that we know CrossFit and just general movement can help enhance our health and happiness. And there's also going to be any inherent risk of fatigue and joint, pain, things like that with movement. So I love that perspective.
I think to that point as well, you said, having good coaches that you can trust. The other thing a good coach can do is when something starts to go wrong, right? Shoulder, you can continue to train. I think a lot of people think, oh, I have to just stop. But like you can continue to train. You just can train around the joint that hurts. The exception to that is back, lower backs and things like that. I think a lot of times it's really challenging to find stuff that you can do. But even then, sled drags, prowler pushes, things like that are often okay. And if you look into someone like Stu McGill's stuff, maybe even beneficial for people who are dealing with back issues and things like that. But there's always something that you can do to train around it, and having a good coach that can help you figure out and navigate some of that, I think, is also really important.
Yeah, I know a lot of the practitioners I've talked to, something that's always resonated with me is the idea of motion is lotion. So even when we feel sore, fatigued, tired, you'll be amazed at just the way moving, even just a little bit, can help your body work through some of those challenges. And so, Kyle, I want to say, yeah, I was going to say, I appreciate all the insights and the stories and hearing your perspective of how you've walked from swimming to fitness to competitive fitness to coaching. I know you're someone who's very analytical and thoughtful when it comes to trying to help athletes hit their potential as well as your own. So for folks who are maybe interested in connecting or learning more about either working with you or some of the information you're sharing, what are the best places for folks to find you?
Well, I'm definitely most active on Instagram. Not that I'm like a super poster or anything. My Instagram is just Kyle Ruth _TTT for Training Think Tank, obviously. And then I'm on the Corpus Animus podcast, the Training Think Tank podcast. say monthly, maybe twice a month. I've been on the last two that have just come out. So I'm on there pretty regularly. And then myself and Max and Kyle Habdo, we all work together to put together the TTT education. So we have a movement course, which talks a lot about the balancing of, the joint mobility versus intensity and things like that, and how to actually rehab athletes, things like that. Actually, it's more return to play. So it's meant more for coaches like us rather than PT practitioners. But I'm sure that PTs could learn quite a bit from it because it is a return to play type course. We have our coaching strength course, which dives fully into how to actually get people stronger rather than talking around strength or about strength. We show people how to create strength training programs that actually improve strength. And that's true whether you're like a concurrent athlete, like a CrossFitter or a hybrid athlete, or just a power lifter or a weightlifter. Like, we cover the bases in that course. And we're currently working on our coaching conditioning course, which we dive deep into building an engine, cover the bases from sprinting all the way to ultra marathon training, but really focusing in on how do you use conditioning to improve field sport? How do you use conditioning to improve CrossFit? How would you train a high rocks? I actually just got done working on the case study for the high rocks case study for the conditioning course. And I think it'll be pretty cool. But yeah, so that's kind of where I'm most active, and you can find more of the information that I'm putting out.
Yeah, phenomenal resources. Highly encourage checking it out, especially if you're a coach who loves learning some of the science mixed in with the actual methodology for how to improve performance from the mental perspective. It's all covered in a variety of podcasts and different resources. So highly recommend checking that out. Thanks so much for spending some time with me. It was fun getting to hear a little bit more about your story and learn some of your insights along the way. Look forward to continuing to stay connected and seeing you soon in February. I think we'll be down in Charleston.
It's going to be fun. Brad, I'm excited, man.